I'm freezing. Let me in. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't knock again. I beg you, she said. I'll repay you. Those were the promises of a poor Apache woman, spoken at a door most men kept closed in winter, because opening it meant choosing who lived and who didn't. I sat in the dim amber of my cabin, the only heat coming from a dying hearth and a cup of coffee so black it looked like oil. My dog, Buck, didn't growl. He just lifted his heavy head from the floorboards and looked at the door, then back at me. He knew the math of the frontier as well as I did. One man, one dog, and a cellar of salted meat can last until April. Add a second soul, and the math breaks by February. I am a man of iron and coal. I've spent 52 years learning that things either hold their shape or they snap under the hammer. I didn't want a guest. I didn't want a witness to the way I lived, slowly fading into the gray Montana timber. I stood up. My knees popped like dry kindling. I reached for the Springfield rifle leaning against the wall, its walnut stock cool and familiar. I didn't pick it up to kill her. I picked it up because out here, you don't open a door to the unknown without a weight in your hand. The wind shrieked through the chinks in the logs as I pulled the heavy latch. The cold hit me first, a physical blow that stole the breath from my lungs. And then, I saw her. She was a ghost wrapped in a man's oversized coat, threadbare and stiff with ice. She wasn't just cold, she was translucent, the way a person gets when the blood has given up on the skin and started retreating to the heart for a final stand. She carried a broken axe, the head jagged and rusted, held against her chest like a wooden crucifix. I looked past her into the white void. No horse, no tracks, the snow had already eaten them. She had walked. Drop the steel, I said. My voice sounded like gravel grinding together. I hadn't used it in 3 days. She didn't drop it. Her fingers were curled around the handle in a death grip, frozen solid. She looked at me, and for a second, I saw it not fear, but a terrifying sort of dignity. It was the look of someone who had already accepted they were dead but hadn't decided to lie down yet. I can work, she whispered. Her lips were cracked and blue. I am not a burden. I looked at her, then at the empty, howling white behind her. If I closed the door, she'd be a frozen statue by dawn, a landmark for the wolves. If I opened it, I was inviting a different kind of death into the house. The slow kind, where you watch your supplies dwindle while you stare at a stranger across a silent table. I stepped back. I didn't offer a hand. I just left the space for her to enter. She stumbled in, the sudden change in air pressure making her knees buckle. She didn't go for the hearth. She collapsed near the door, her breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. I kicked the door shut and dropped the bar. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the whistling wind and the frantic, rhythmic chattering of her teeth. I didn't speak. I didn't ask her name or her tribe or who had hunted her into the barrens. I went to the stove, threw in 2 logs of seasoned larch, and pumped the bellows until the coals glowed a fierce, angry orange. I grabbed a tin mug, filled it with hot water and a spoonful of honey, and set it on the floor near her. Drink, I commanded. She reached out. Her hands were scarred, the palms thick with the kind of calluses you only get from years of pulling rope or hauling stone. She wasn't a lady of the fort. She was a laborer. She took a sip, her throat working convulsively. I sat on my stool, the Springfield across my lap. Buck walked over to her, sniffed the hem of her frozen coat, and let out a low, mournful whine. He smelled the frostbite. He smelled the end of the line. The axe, I said, nodding toward the broken tool she still clutched. Why did you carry a piece of scrap through a blizzard? She looked down at the jagged metal. A strange, fleeting shadow passed over her face. It is mine, she said. The only thing. They did not take. Who is they? She didn't answer. She just clutched the axe tighter. I watched her for a long time. The ice on her coat began to melt, dripping onto the floorboards in a steady, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a clock ticking down. I got up and walked to the corner of the room where my forge tools sat. I picked up a file. I didn't know why I did it, but I felt the need to hear the sound of metal on metal. It was the only language I trusted. You'll sleep in the shed, I said, pointing to the lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. It was insulated with hay and pelts, but it wasn't the hearth. I don't know you. I don't trust people who arrive with the storm. She nodded, accepting the terms without a word of protest. She dragged herself up, using the wall for support. She was taller than she looked, with a spine like an iron rod. As she moved toward the back door, the oversized coat shifted. I caught a glimpse of her wrists. They weren't just red from the cold. They were circled by thick, jagged welts, marks from rawhide bindings that had been pulled tight enough to scream. She saw me looking. She didn't hide them. She just pulled the sleeves down and stepped into the shadows of the lean-to. I sat back down by the fire, the rifle still heavy on my knees. The wind hammered at the logs, trying to find a way back in. I looked at the spot on the floor where she had sat. There was a small puddle of melted snow, and in the center of it, a single, dark drop of blood that hadn't quite mixed with the water. Buck growled softly in his sleep. I realized then that I hadn't asked her name, and she hadn't asked mine. I reached out and blew out the lamp, leaving only the red glow of the embers. In the darkness, I heard a sound from the lean-to. It wasn't a sob. It was the rhythmic, metallic scrape of her trying to sharpen that broken axe head against a stone in the dark. The floorboards didn't just creak, they groaned under the weight of a secret. I didn't move. I kept my breathing shallow, my hand resting on the cold steel of the Springfield. In the darkness, the mind plays tricks, but the nose doesn't. I smelled the wet wool of her coat and the metallic tang of the forge. She was standing 3 feet from my bed. "The fire is dying," she whispered. Her voice wasn't a threat, it was a hollow observation. "The dog is cold." I sat up slowly, the rifle barrel tracking the movement of her shadow. Buck was indeed shivering at the foot of the bed, his tail tucked tight. I didn't look at her. I looked at the embers in the hearth, now nothing more than glowing red eyes in the dark. "Go back to the shed, Clara," I said. "I handle the fire." She didn't move. She stood there like a pillar of salt. I contended. "I know the wood. Larch burns fast. Pine pops. You have oak hidden under the bench. It lasts the night." I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I felt a surge of irritation, not because she was awake, but because she was right. I had been rationing the oak. I stood up, towering over her in the gloom, expecting her to flinch. She didn't. She looked up at me with a gaze that had seen much worse things than a tired man with a gun. "Sleep," she said, and it sounded less like a suggestion and more like an order from a weary officer. I watched her walk to the hearth. She knelt with a grace that didn't belong to a dying woman. She didn't use the bellows. She leaned in and blew a steady, controlled stream of air into the coals until they flared. She fed the fire one stick at a time, moving with a silent efficiency that made me realize she had spent her life making sure others stayed warm while she stayed in the cold. I didn't go back to sleep. I sat in the chair by the window, watching her silhouette against the rising flames. By dawn, the storm had tapered off into a haunting, rhythmic hum. I went outside to chop ice from the water barrel, the air so sharp it felt like inhaling needles. When I came back in, the cabin smelled of something I hadn't smelled in years, rendered fat and scorched flour. She had found the sack of hardtack and a jar of bacon grease I'd tucked away. She was frying the biscuits in a cast-iron skillet, her movements stiff but purposeful. "I didn't give you permission to touch my stores," I said, dropping the ice chunk into the pot. "Hungry people don't ask for permission," she replied, her back to me. "They survive. You want to eat, or you want to be right?" I sat down. We ate in a silence so thick it felt like a third person at the table. She ate like a wolf, quick, quiet, eyes darting to the door every time the wind shifted. She still had the broken axe propped against her chair. "You're looking for someone," I said, cleaning my plate with a crust of bread. "No," she said, her eyes dropping to her scarred wrists. "I am looking for nowhere. I think I found it." I spent the afternoon in the forge, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the hammer. I was working on a set of hinges for a rancher 3 days' ride south, provided the passes cleared. Every time I looked up, she was there. Not inside, but just outside the door, hauling heavy logs from the woodpile that she should have been too weak to lift. She worked until her nose bled from the cold. She didn't wipe it away. She just kept moving. She was trying to pay for her breath, pound for pound. Late in the day, I caught her staring at the anvil. Her eyes weren't on the tools, but on the way the heat shimmered off the iron. Suddenly, her hand began to twitch. Then her arm. A violent tremor took hold of her, and she dropped the log she was carrying. Her eyes rolled back, and she slumped against the doorframe, her body racking with a silent, terrifying convulsion. I dropped my hammer and caught her before her head hit the stone. She wasn't choking. She was vibrating, her jaw locked tight, her breath coming in jagged gasps. I held her down, keeping her away from the glowing forge, my hands gripping her shoulders like a vice. It lasted a minute. To me, it felt like an hour of watching a soul try to shake itself loose from its cage. When it stopped, she lay limp in the soot, her chest heaving. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, I saw true, raw terror. Not of me, of herself. She scrambled backward, hitting the wall, her breath coming in shallow pants. She looked at her hands as if they were treacherous animals. I am not. Cursed, she spat out, the words wet with blood from where she'd bitten her tongue. It is just the shaking. It comes when it wants. I stood up, my own heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at her, then at the heavy iron tools surrounding us. On the frontier, they called it the falling sickness. Most folks thought it was the devil reaching out. They'd hang a person for less. I reached down and picked up the log she had dropped. I placed it back on the pile. The oak is heavy, I said, my voice flat. Go inside, drink the tea. She looked at me, waiting for the judgment. Waiting for me to point to the door and the white waste beyond it. I just picked up my hammer and struck the anvil, a single, ringing note that cut through the fear in the room. The bird sat on the edge of the table, its wooden wings frozen in a silent flight. It was a fine piece of work, delicate enough to make me forget for a second that it had been birthed from a stolen piece of my winter fuel and a bloody thumb. I didn't throw it into the fire. I put it on the mantelpiece, next to an old, rusted spur that was the only thing I had left of a horse I'd loved. The next morning, the falling sickness hung between us like a thin sheet of ice. She was waiting for me to break it, to tell her to pack her rags and take her devil elsewhere. But I was never a man for preaching or judging. Iron is iron, and if there's a flaw in the grain, you don't curse the metal. You just learn how to work around it. I found her by the woodpile, her face pale, her hands trembling as she tried to lift the heavy splitting maul. Sit, I said. She didn't look up. I can do it. The shaking is gone. I didn't say you couldn't do it. I said sit. I took the maul from her. It was too heavy for her frame, even on her best days. I pointed to a stump near the forge door. She sat, clutching her oversized coat around her, watching me with those wary, hawk-like eyes. They chased you for the shaking, I said, the words coming out as I swung the maul. Crack! A log of larch split clean down the center. She stayed silent for a long time, watching the wood fly. Then, she spoke to the snow. My father was a preacher in a town near the Missouri. He said the spirit of my mother was trying to claw its way out of me because I was born in sin. He tried to beat it out, then he tried to starve it out. I stopped swinging. The air was so quiet I could hear the frost forming on the trees. When that didn't work, she continued, her voice devoid of any self-pity. They put me in a wagon and drove me 3 days into the hills. They gave me that axe and told me if I ever walked back, they'd hang me for a witch. They said the wilderness would either cure me or bury me. She looked at me then, her jaw set. The wilderness didn't do either. It just made me cold. I didn't offer her a sermon. I didn't tell her I was sorry. I just looked at the jagged line of the horizon. Folks in towns need someone to blame for the things they don't understand. Out here, there's no one to blame but the wind. And the wind don't care if you're a saint or a ghost. I walked over to the shed and pulled out a small, light hand axe I'd forged for a trapper who never came back to pay for it. I handed it to her. The maul is for men who have more muscle than sense, I said. This one is for people who know where to strike. She took the axe. She felt the balance of it, her fingers tracing the smooth hickory handle. For a moment, the hardness in her eyes softened, just a fraction. I can stay? She asked. I looked at the cabin, the peeling bark, the sagging porch, the silence that had been rotting me from the inside out for 5 years. I thought about the wooden bird on the mantel. The roof needs patching, I said, turning back to the woodpile. And the dog likes the way you cook the hardtack. You stay until the spring thaw. Then we'll see what the world looks like. She didn't thank me. She just stood up, walked to a smaller log, and buried the hand axe deep into the wood with a single, precise stroke. The rest of the week was a slow crawl of labor. I taught her how to tend the bellows without smothering the fire. She taught me that if you soak dried beans in melted snow for a full day, they don't taste like gravel. We functioned like two gears in a rusted machine that was finally starting to turn again. But the secret she was carrying wasn't just about the shaking. I saw it in the way she looked toward the South Pass every time the wind died down. She wasn't just cast out, she was being hunted. Late that evening, as I was cleaning my rifle by the fire, she was sitting in the corner, sewing a patch onto my old wool blanket. "Arthur," she said. It was the first time she'd used my name. Yeah, the men who drove me out. They weren't just my kin. They were law. Or they wore the tin stars that made them think they were. I stopped rubbing the oil into the barrel. "Why does that matter now?" "Because," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't leave empty-handed. She reached into the inner lining of her coat and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was stained with water and dirt, but the brass clasp was still bright. "This is why I carried the axe," she said. "I knew they'd come for this, and they'd come for me to make sure I never read what's inside." The whistle cut through the cabin's warmth like a razor through silk. It was too rhythmic, too intentional, the sound of men who hunted in pairs. I didn't look at the ledger. I didn't look at Clara. I blew out the lamp in one breath, plunging us into a world of flickering red embers and deep, jagged shadows. "Get under the floorboards," I whispered. She didn't argue. She didn't panic. She grabbed the ledger and the small hand axe I'd given her, disappearing into the dark crawl space beneath the kitchen pantry. I slid the heavy oak table over the hatch and grabbed the Springfield. I stood by the window, my breath shallow. Minutes crawled by. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and Buck's low, vibrating growl. Then, a voice drifted over the snow, polite and cold. "Art Thorne, we know you're in there, Sergeant. We aren't looking for trouble with a veteran. We're just looking for a thief." I didn't answer. I watched the tree line. Two shapes emerged, men on horseback, wrapped in heavy furs, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. They didn't look like lawmen. They looked like the kind of men the law hires when it wants a job buried. They sat there for a long time, letting the cold do the talking. When they realized I wasn't coming out, they turned their horses and retreated back into the timber. They weren't leaving, they were circling. "They're gone for now," I said, moving the table. Clara climbed out, her face ghost white, her hands trembling not from the sickness this time, but from the raw chill of the earth. She looked at me, waiting for the question. "What's in the book, Clara?" She opened the ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of land deeds, cattle brands, and names of families who had disappeared or moved on from the valley near the Missouri. Next to each name was a price. Her father hadn't just been a preacher. He'd been the ledger keeper for a land-grabbing ring. "I took it the night they tried to drive me into the hills," she said, her voice steady. "I thought if I had the truth, they wouldn't kill me. I was wrong. It only gave them a reason to hunt me." I looked at the book, then at the small wooden bird she'd carved. My world had been simple: iron, wood, and silence. Now, it was filled with the greed of men 600 miles away. "We can't fight them in a blizzard," I said. "And we can't run. We work." The next morning, the labor changed. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about fortification. We didn't talk about the men in the woods, but we worked as if they were watching. I spent the day in the forge, not making hinges, but sharpening every blade I owned. Clara worked beside me. I taught her how to temper steel, how to watch for the moment the metal turns from a cherry red to a straw yellow, the exact second it gains its strength. "Hold the tongs," I commanded. She gripped them. The heat from the forge was immense, but she didn't flinch. We moved in a silent choreography of sweat and soot. I showed her how to use the weight of her body, not just her arms, to swing the hammer. For the first time, she wasn't just a guest. She was an apprentice to the iron. In the evenings, we sat by the fire, but we didn't sit in the center of the room. We sat in the corners, away from the windows. I watched her sew a heavy leather lining into her coat, her movements becoming more deliberate, more grounded. "Why did you stay?" she asked one night, her eyes on the flames. "When the war ended, why come here?" I looked at my hands. They were stained with coal dust that would never wash off. "I spent 4 years breaking things, Clara. Men, horses, towns. I thought if I came here, I could learn how to make things instead. But the silence, it doesn't build anything. It just lets you rot. She reached out and touched the sleeve of my shirt. It was a small gesture, no longer than a heartbeat, but it felt heavier than the hammer. We aren't rotting, Arthur. We're waiting. We spent the rest of the week preparing. I reinforced the doors with iron straps. Clara spent her hours in the shed, not just splitting wood, but stacking it in a way that created a breastwork against the north-facing window. We were two broken people building a fortress out of scraps. One afternoon, the air grew unnaturally still. The wind stopped its howling, and the sky turned a bruised, heavy purple. "They've waited long enough," I said, checking the percussion caps on the rifle. Clara walked to the center of the room. She picked up the hand axe. She didn't look like the trembling ghost who had collapsed on my doorstep. She looked like the steel we had tempered together, hardened by the fire, cooled by the ice. "Arthur," she said softly. I turned. She was standing by the mantelpiece, holding the wooden bird. She placed it carefully in the hidden pocket of her coat. "I'm not going back under the floorboards," she said. It wasn't a question. The scraping stopped. A heavy silence settled over the cabin, the kind that precedes a lightning strike. I stood in the center of the room. The Springfield held low, my thumb resting on the hammer. Clara was 5 feet to my left, shadowed by the chimney stack. Her hand axe gripped so tight her knuckles were white as the snow outside. A knock came. 3 slow, rhythmic thuds. "Art Thorne," the voice called out. It was the same man from the woods, but now he sounded closer, almost neighborly. "The wind is turning. It's going to be a cold night for a gunfight. Why don't you open the door? We can talk about the ledger and a bottle of rye I've got in my saddlebag." I looked at Clara. She didn't move. She didn't shake. The falling sickness was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. "I don't drink with men who whistle in the dark," I called back. "A shame," the voice replied, the warmth vanishing instantly. "We aren't here for you, Sergeant. Give us the girl and the book, and you can go back to your silence. Otherwise, we'll burn this shack with you inside it." They expected us to panic. They expected a man like me to value his hide over a stranger. But they didn't understand the bond of the forge. When you spend weeks tempering steel with someone, you stop being two people and start being a single blade. "Clara," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the door. "I'm staying," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was a statement of fact, as solid as the oak table. I kicked a heavy trunk in front of the door and motioned for her to move to the kitchen. "If they start the fire, we use the water barrels. If they come through the window, you aim for the throat." The first shot shattered the glass of the east window, sending a spray of diamonds across the floor. I dropped to one knee and returned fire, the roar of the Springfield deafening in the small space. Smoke filled the room, acrid and thick. I heard a grunt from outside, a hit, but not a kill. Then came the sound of a heavy log being used as a ram against the door. Boom, boom. The iron straps I'd forged groaned, but they held. "The back!" Clara yelled. I turned just as a shadow obscured the kitchen window. A man was trying to force the frame. Clara didn't wait. She didn't scream. She stepped into the light of the dying fire and swung the hand axe with a short, brutal arc. I heard a sickening thud and a scream of pure agony. The shadow vanished, dragging a trail of red across the windowsill. She stood there, chest heaving, the axe stained dark. She looked at me, and in that moment, the last of the victim died. She was no longer the girl cast out by her father. She was a woman who had fought for her place by my hearth. The ramming stopped. Outside, the horses whinnied in terror. "Thorne!" the man screamed from the darkness. "You're a dead man. We'll wait. You can't stay awake forever. I've spent 5 years awake in this silence," I muttered to myself. "I can wait another night." We sat in the dark for hours. We didn't speak. We sat back to back on the floor, the warmth of her body against mine, the only thing keeping the creeping frost at bay. Every time she felt a tremor start in her arm, I leaned back harder against her, anchoring her to the world, letting her know I was there. Around 3 in the morning, the wind picked up a true Montana gale. It was our shield. No man could keep a torch lit in that, and no man could stand still long enough to aim. "Arthur," she whispered, her head resting back against my shoulder. "Yeah, I used to think I was a broken thing, like the axe. I reached back and squeezed her hand. Her skin was rough, scarred, and strong. Nothing is ever truly broken, Clara. It's just waiting to be forged into something else. I'm not leaving, she said. Even when the snow melts, even if they come back with 20 men, this is my home. The word hit me harder than the bullets had. Home. It was a word I hadn't allowed myself to use since the war. It was a word that required a future. The horses stood like stone statues in the morning mist, their breath blooming in white clouds. There was no sign of the men. The wilderness had a way of settling debts that lead and powder couldn't reach. In the brutal cold of a Montana dawn, if you lose your fire or your focus for even an hour, the land claims you. I stepped out onto the porch, the Springfield tucked under my arm. The ledger sat on the stump, its pages white and beckoning like a grave marker. I didn't go to it. I didn't need the names of dead men or the records of stolen dirt anymore. Clara walked out behind me. She was wrapped in the heavy wool blanket, her face pale but her eyes clear. She looked at the riderless horses, then at the vast, silent timber. "They're gone," she said. It wasn't a question. "The mountain took them," I replied. They were city hunters. They didn't know that out here, you don't hunt the storm. The storm hunts you. We stood there for a long time, watching the sun struggle to climb over the jagged peaks of the Badlands. The world felt scrubbed clean. The violence of the night muffled by a fresh layer of powder. For the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a clean slate. We didn't celebrate. There was too much work to do. We spent the day cleaning the glass from the floor and scrubbing the blood from the windowsill. I hammered the iron straps back into shape, and Clara spent hours in the lean-to, organizing the seeds she had carried in her pocket, the ones her mother had given her before the world went sour. "The soil will be ready in a month," she said, looking at the frozen patch of earth behind the forge. I didn't answer right away. I was busy at the anvil, but I wasn't Wren, forging a weapon. I was working on a plow blade, the metal glowing a soft, hopeful orange. "We'll need to clear the rocks first," I said, "and the fence needs to be higher if we're going to keep the elk out of your garden." She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. A small, genuine smile touched her lips, the first one I'd ever seen. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of recognition. We were no longer survivors waiting for the end. We were builders planning for the beginning. As the weeks passed, the snow began to retreat, revealing the resilient green of the mountain grass. The falling sickness still came for Clara occasionally, but it no longer carried the sting of shame. When the tremors started, she would simply sit by the fire or lean against the cooling forge, and I would be there, a steady shadow in the corner, until the storm inside her passed. One evening, as the first spring peepers began to chirp in the creek, I took the ledger from the stump. I didn't read it. I walked to the hearth and laid it on the glowing coals. We watched the names of the greedy, and the records of the stolen land turn to ash. "What are we now?" she asked softly, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. I looked at her, then at the wooden bird on the mantel, and finally at the steady, rhythmic beat of the hammer resting against my chair. "We're the ones who stayed," I said. I sat down and picked up a piece of oak. I didn't have a plan for it, but as I began to shave away the rough bark, I realized I was carving a second wing. A bird can't fly with just one, and a house can't stand with just a ghost. The frontier story teaches us that no soul is ever truly broken beyond repair. We are merely waiting for the right fire to temper us. For those who have walked a long road, it is easy to mistake silence for loneliness or scars for failure. However, true dignity is found in the steady rhythm of daily labor and the courage to remain when it is easier to run. This story reminds us that home is not a place we find, but a sanctuary we build through mutual respect and shared burdens. Even when the falling sickness of life shakes our foundation, having a purpose or a person to anchor us makes the storm bearable. As we grow older, we realize that our value does not come from being perfect, but from being useful. Like iron in the forge, our trials do not destroy us. They refine us into something more resilient. The ultimate lesson is that peace is the quiet choice to stay, to burn the ledgers of our past grievances, and to trust that even the harshest winter is merely the precursor to a new spring. We are not rotting. We are waiting for our season to bloom again.